Case number one is bearing witness. And if you read bearing witness, you're going to read the details of an article that the New York Times released that had some very gruesome and explicit images from inside a prison. And the criticism of publication of these images is that this is distasteful, it's desensitizing for the viewers that see it, and it's also possibly exploitative of the prisoners whose images are now forever enshrined on the internet. It's also the case that perhaps these images might be viewed as simply shock entertainment, and it's also the case that people might view these images and not do anything about it, might think that simply the fact that they feel disgusted is the extent of their moral and their political obligation. However, a couple of questions come out of this. The first one is, is the publication of images such as these ever justified? Is it ever okay to publish gruesome images? And also, does seeing the images of an injustice generate an obligation to actually do anything about that injustice? Well, my team thought about this case. They came to the preliminary conclusion that, yes, it is okay, and in some cases, journalists may have a moral obligation to publish images such as these, but they wanted to provide the qualification up front that the audience should be appropriate. So that the New York Times, especially with some sort of a warning or a disclaimer, letting viewers know that graphic images are ahead would be appropriate. But you wouldn't want to put images such as that in a Boy Scout magazine or a Scholastic magazine or something targeting children or where children would have easy access to it. Why might these images be justifiably published? Why might they be possibly obligatory for some journalists to publish? Well, it's the case that you need to see a situation firsthand to see the specific details, to appreciate the gravity of what's going on, such that you can make an informed decision about it. So some examples might include the conditions within factory farms and the treatment of animals, possibly torture of prisoners and executions by ISIS, possibly even exposure of our own military prison, Abu Ghraib. Maybe things as simple as the effects of smoking on our lungs or of using methamphetamines. The classic image of a seagull or a sea turtle with a plastic ring stuck in its body. Possibly glaciers melting. And maybe even images of aborted, unborn, developing humans. Now, none of these images would be easy to view, and all of them would generate some level of discomfort. However, if we don't fully understand and fully appreciate and fully take in the specific details and what's at stake with all these issues, how can we make a fully informed decision? Now, one caution here is that we need to ensure that the images that we intake are balanced, because we would be subject to one-sided manipulation if we only viewed, for example, the torture of ISIS and execution of ISIS prisoners. If we're seeing images that are encouraging people to go to war, we might also want to see images of the collateral damage of bombing, such as the notorious picture of a little girl who had been burned by napalm in Vietnam. If we see factory farming images, we might want to also see images of open range farming and where animals are treated humanely, so we can make more informed decisions about what sorts of meat and meat from which companies and which factories and which farms would be more or less ethical to consume. If we're going to see images of aborted, unborn, developing humans, we might also want to hear the stories of women whose lives were saved by an abortion. That obligation to provide that balanced information does somewhat fall on journalists' shoulders, but also just as reasonable adults who understand that the media is going to present a biased picture, the obligation also falls on us to seek out that balanced information. This is one reason whenever I watch the news, I'll flip between MSNBC, Fox News, and CNN to get a nice variety of perspective. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, but it certainly doesn't lie on one channel exclusively. Now, a question that arose from the case was, does seeing an injustice generate a corresponding obligation to address it and do something about it? My team argued that yes, it does generate some obligation, but however, what that obligation is would depend on the viewer's proximity and power. So, for example, if in the original case of the prisoners enduring the inhumane conditions, the warden would have a very strong obligation to do something about this. So too would jailers that have the power and have the proximity and have a direct responsibility to do something. I mean, they have just a obligation via our entrusted them to oversee the prisoner's time in prison. If you're a disconnected stranger, perhaps you have an obligation to vote for candidates that you have reason to think would do something to address this. But if you were a family member of one of these prisoners, perhaps your obligation would be stronger to advocate more voraciously, to reach out to your elected officials more immediately. And perhaps if you're just simply a disinterested stranger and a citizen, you would have a similar obligation. But my team argued that to the extent that you have a connection to the prisoner and also the power to do something about this, your obligation to act would increase. But at the same time, we want to put limits, and we have to put limits on what we're able to tackle and what we're able to address. If it were the case that we attempted to rectify every injustice that we ever saw, that would lead to, I suspect, a very ineffective and frustrating life. We might consider the advice of Stephen Covey, who argued that we should align our sphere of concern with our sphere of influence, which just means that if you find yourself worrying about lots of things outside of your control, either expand your power such that you can do something about those things, or contract your sphere of concern so that you don't frustrate yourself worrying over things that you really can't do anything about. Those are some initial considerations. Hope these were helpful.